Lee, good. Got it.
Bill, this is you here.
Okay.
Good evening. My name's Graham Allison, and I would like to welcome you to this evening forum session sponsored by the Harvard Institute for International Development and the Center for Science and International Affairs. The question on the table tonight is whether or not the United States should offer Burma a diplomatic roadmap that would provide various graduated responses on the U.S. part to moves that they might make towards democracy and controlling narcotics. We're fortunate to have a speaker who's most well suited to offer us knowledgeable insights. Congressman Bill Richardson, who's been a visitor a number of times here to the Kennedy School and actually taught a course here back some time past, as well as presented a forum here with Senator Simpson on immigration that many of you will remember, is going to speak to us. Bill is from New Mexico, has been the President Clinton's personal envoy to Burma, and has visited both leaders within the SLORC and also Aung San Suu Kyi. Indeed, he was the first non-family member to visit her in her 5 years of detention. He'll offer us his thoughts on this topic, contrasting it with an approach that would attempt to isolate the country further. After Bill has spoken, I'll introduce the members of our panel. Bill Richardson.
Thank you, Dean Allison, for that overly generous introduction. I have been in New Mexico for 3 weeks talking about the contract with America, so if I seem to be far behind these other distinguished speakers in knowledge and what's been happening, I hope you forgive me. I want to say that when you deal with Burma, you become addicted to it in a positive way. The land, the people, the religion, the traditions have a way of drawing you, and they have a way of getting you engaged, even though you want to make sure that you're dealing with other issues that always come back. And because of what I consider a privileged situation with me, that I was the first non-family member to meet Aung San Suu Kyi, we spent about 8 hours together in a total of 2 meetings, this was truly an inspiring event for me, and inevitably leads me once again to try to deal with this issue from a policy standpoint. Let me give you an assessment of where I think things are with the SLORC and where I see the 4 options that exist for U.S. foreign policy as we deal with Burma. And I think that July 11th is an important date because that marks the 7th year of her incarceration. And I think it's important that that day, I think the SLORC, their intentions will be known about what they want to do with her. And I think that should be a guideline for U.S. foreign policy and international foreign policy too. Because I think we've been gravitating between a variety of policy options, and I think the time has come to take a stand. Here is my perception of where SLORC, Myanmar foreign policy is right now. I think there's been a retrenchment there, a negative retrenchment, where the conservative element within the SLORC leadership seems to have the upper hand. I think they have been buttressed by their recent victories over the Karen. I think they've been buttressed by the fact that a majority of ASEAN countries have chosen a policy of engagement, of not pressuring them, principally Thailand and others. I think that basically they have been disappointed, the SLORC, in a positive response from the United States. Okay, we allowed this congressman in, we've released some prisoners, we have taken certain steps that we consider to be gradual movements towards liberalization. What have we gotten out of it? I perceive that the SLORC has decided in answering these questions that right now they're going to tough it out, that they're going to be hardened, that they will not seek positive initiatives with the United States. Here's why. I don't think that in July Aung San Suu Kyi will be released. There were some hopeful signs that that would happen. I don't think she will. In fact, there have been some initiatives within there, what I consider to be fake parliamentary democracy initiatives that will prevent her from participating in politics, much less running for office in that country. Number two, there's been very negative recent developments that deal with her husband not getting a visa to even visit her. Minimally, this has been permitted. Her family was allowed to visit without any conditions. This has even caused the Secretary General of the United Nations to make a public statement against this. Another negative situation, one of the promises made to me on my visit was permission to allow members of the International Committee for the Red Cross to come in and inspect the prisons. The SLORC have been retrenching. They've been making excuses. They've sent back a memorandum of understanding to the Geneva-based organization, basically saying, we can't do this unless it's under our conditions being that if any Red Cross individual comes to the prison, there has to be a member of the SLORC in any interrogation present at all times. This is unacceptable. There have been 7 people arrested recently at a funeral of Un Nu for minor reasons, given life sentences. Very negative situation. I mentioned before the refugees, the Karen refugees. I think they've been buttressed by what they perceive are some victories there. Thousands of refugees have been storming into Thailand, violating Thai territory. The Thais have made public statements on that, but I don't think that that necessarily is going to change the Thai foreign policy towards Burma, which I consider to be very, very weak in terms of human rights. They have launched attacks, the SLORC, on Kun Sa, the drug lord who right now is a very key player in that part of the world. That while they're not directing their attacks at his stronghold, they are in an effort to show a commitment to the international narcotics trade to take a stand. I don't think necessarily these are going to be significant military initiatives that will leave anything definitive in the days ahead. As I mentioned before, within this last period, there have been some hopeful signs. I think you have to point at those majoritively negative signs, but 130 political prisoners have been released in the last 4 months. 2 close allies of Aung San Suu Kyi, 2 individuals that I had pressed for their release in her political high command were released. The SLORC did have, at the request of mine and others, meetings with Aung San Suu Kyi, 2 meetings, where the discussions, what they discussed, are basically unknown. But I think clearly if a discussion of her release from house arrest and other factors were made that may have been positive at the time, probably because of this retrenchment, right now are not valid. So what do we do about it? What do we do about foreign policy towards Burma? I'm talking about the United States and a little bit the international community. Let me tell you what I think the 4 options are. And I haven't totally thought this through. I was trying to do that before this forum. But clearly it's been a vexing issue to a lot of policymakers. And what is encouraging here, Dean, is that we are having a meeting on Burma. I mean, Aung San Suu Kyi should be another Mandela, and she doesn't get the credit or attention she deserves. I mean, there are some real issues, human rights, many others that are important, and because it's not a strategic area, we don't pay attention to Burma. So I'm glad to see this very good sign of attendance here. What are the four options that we have? I will call them as follows. 1, the sanctions group. 2, the constructive engagement group. 3, the Clinton policy. And 4, the fourth way, which is what I am going to propose we might do, and I'll be developing that as we go along. Very glad to see Sandra Burton here. She was with Time Magazine. She covered.
Still is.
She still, but you're here. She covered when I was there, and she will sympathize with everything I'm saying, or maybe not. First, let me talk about the sanctions group. Who wants sanctions? I would say there's several groups of people. Human rights groups. Basically, sanctions is stop dealing with these people. They're bad guys. Put trade, investment sanctions. Cut off their aid. We don't give them any aid, but if you can find aid that you're not giving, you want to cut it off, just do it. They're hopeless. Go after them. I would put human rights groups, not everyone in this category. I would put right now a majority of the Congress. And this is significant because you will see Republican and Democratic members emerging in the days ahead putting cutoff initiatives that probably would pass. Who would vote against cutting off aid to the SLORC or trade or investment? Talking about the U.S. Congress here, moving probably ahead of the administration and probably taking some initiatives in the next 30 to 60 days. So watch that one. Some in the Clinton administration, those that feel that the wait-and-see, constructive engagement, carrot-and-stick policy is not working. Let's clamp down. Those officials at the National Security Council, at state, those that want to see a stronger human rights dimension to the policy. I would put the New York Times, the Boston Globe, influential media as part of that sanctions policy that basically says, not only should you impose sanctions, but downgrade the relationship. We have a DCM there, Deputy Chief of Mission, not even an ambassador. Get rid of the DCM, send a message that's too high an individual in diplomacy to represent us, bring that down. And by all means, don't give them any narcotics aid. There's been a policy debate within the Clinton administration, give them a little narcotics training, DEA agents, equipment. By all means, don't do that. That's the sanctions group. And I would say that that group is emerging right now as the strongest of all the groups because of these recent developments, these initiatives that I consider to be retrenchment on the part of the SLORC. Then we have the constructive engagement group. What is that group? That group basically says, like South Africa, you have to engage these people. You can't isolate them. You got to give them something. You can't call them pariahs and expect them to respond. Expose them to the outside world. I would put in this category the U.S. business community that has investments there. I would put in this category ASEAN countries, primarily led by Thailand and Japan and others, Singapore especially, that took great exception to my trip on human rights grounds. Basically, economically, you expose them, you trade with them. That's how you make some kind of initiatives. Who wants constructive engagement policy? Within the Clinton administration, there's some in the drug office that want to move ahead with some narcotics training in exchange for some human rights improvements. I would put the United Nations and the Secretary General, who has sent 2 teams to Burma, basically following the lead of the ASEAN group, raising human rights, but basically saying, don't slam them, let's give them something. Let's have a little bit of a constructive engagement. That's the constructive engagement crowd that I think has been losing credibility and has been hurt very badly by SLORC's recent actions. The latest group being, and very significant, is 2 very distinguished U.S. senators, John McCain and Chuck Robb, that recently were in Burma, who literally were told, we don't need the U.S., do whatever you want. Not two people you want to upset, especially in a Republican administration. I used to be the majority whip. I'm now the minority whip, so I know the difference these days between those positions. But in any event, especially John McCain, he is not somebody on this issue you want to make mad, and Tommy Vallely knows this issue very well, and I'm sure he'll amplify on it.
Making him mad, you mean?
Then I will move towards the Clinton policy, which basically I have been supporting, which I think is one that basically says carrot and stick, but don't give them too much carrot. We see a positive evolution. They did meet with Aung San Suu Kyi. They did release those prisoners, but don't give them any narcotics money. Don't upgrade the relationship. Kind of wait and see what they do with the Red Cross. Let's not totally shut them off. Trade embargo, the position being, yes, it makes us feel good, but a trade embargo, let me tell you, as we have pursued many throughout the world, they don't work unless they're multilateral. If we have a trade embargo, it doesn't do any good if all the goods are smuggled through Thailand, and Thailand doesn't want to have it. So we can talk about a trade embargo and impose one, but the practical effect, I think, is not going to be very negative. It's not going to be very positive. We still may do it. We still maybe we should do it in the absence of any kind of movement. I'm not discouraging it. I'm just telling what I think are practical realities. What else might be contemplated? Getting the international community engaged at the G7, for instance, upcoming meeting, a statement on Burma, raising the profile of the issue. I think that will continue to be the Clinton administration policy. Now, here's the fourth group, and this is the way I think we should go. Now, don't take this down because I haven't totally thought this through, and nobody's going to listen anyway. I think a lot of good constructive criticism will come from you and from the speakers, because this is a very difficult issue. You want some constructive change. Jimmy Carter used the foreign policy baton. It worked in places like Chile and others. It didn't work in others. Sometimes the last thing you want, the last thing I want to see is Aung San Suu Kyi stuck in prison another 10 years and taking away her visiting privileges. It could be that if you put on a sanction, that will be the result. It could be that there'll be more arrests. It could be there'll be worse of a retrenchment. What are we going to do? We can't go in militarily. So I think you have to be very careful about what we do. Here's what I think we should do. And it's basically based on frustration, and the time has come for individuals like me probably to start taking a stand. Now, I do think we've taken a stand on the Clinton policy, but it could be that because of this retrenchment, we got to be a little stronger now. I would support something that Tom and the Harvard Institute for International Affairs has been talking about, and that's a contact group for Burma, multilateralizing the pressure. We've been alone in the pressure, and I think if we get countries like Japan and India and Australia, which has very positive policy towards Burma, that is on the verge of putting sanctions on, if we try to just simply get the administration at the highest level to raises, that makes a difference. I can tell you, after 11 years in Congress, sometimes an issue doesn't happen because it's not raised at a high-level meeting. I think we need to establish a contact group like we have in the former Yugoslavia. I know that hasn't worked terribly well, but at least it's multilateral pressure. In Serbia, on that issue, you've got Japan, you've got France, Britain, Germany, and the United States, a contact group trying to figure out what to do. They haven't figured that out, but at least we're not out there alone. I think we need this kind of approach towards Burma. Number two, I think we have to set some deadlines. I think July 11 is one. If there is no significant progress with Aung San Suu Kyi, I think that has to be the key. Her unconditional release, her ability to be able to participate in Burma, some kind of democratization. They have this sham democratic process going on with parties, and some kind of movement that shows that there is that positive move. Then I believe that that should be the cornerstone of our policy. If that doesn't happen, then I think we got to start talking about a contact group type of pressure or type of carrot and stick based on dates. 90 days later, 60 days later, if this doesn't happen, make it public. That's what I propose. I think that for us to forget about Burma, I think that for us not to take a stand, for us to continue wishing that things are better, I think has reached the point where eventually the international community, the United States, has to take a stand. So that's what I am advocating. I am not saying do the sanctions today. I am saying put some deadlines, multilateralize it, try to get the United Nations a little more involved. I think they've held back a little bit because of pressure from the ASEAN countries. I would like to see the President of the United States, as he did. He gave me a letter for Aung San Suu Kyi, a very strong letter. And again, I don't think the President should be faulted for his policy. I think he has not caved into pressure to proceed with narcotics aid. He has not caved into pressure to put an ambassador there. We've been waiting and trying to give the SLORC a chance. That was, I think, a result perhaps of my visit, where they suddenly agreed to let a foreigner see her, and they agreed to meetings. They did meet with her. They did release some prisoners, so there was some hope. But now there seems to be a retrenchment on these other areas that I believe exists. So with that, Dean, I think this would provoke a lively debate. I don't know what to call the fourth way, because I will after the first question. But I think this is what we ought to do. We can't totally close the door, but it's reaching a point where we may have to.
Great. Thank you very much, Congressman Richardson. And I think that the tone in which you've introduced the topic and the form really invites us all to wrestle with a complex issue. And we've got a good panel to get us started, but then we'll have some time to go to the audience, and I think suggestions about both the refinements of the fourth way and perhaps ideas about a fifth way, if you've got one of those, and pros and cons will be most welcome. We have three folks from the panel to speak, and let me introduce all three of them here, and then we'll begin with Tom Vallely. Tom Vallely, who will speak first, is the director of Harvard's Institute for International Development's Indochina program, and he'll speak about the regional context in which Burma and the other nations of Southeast Asia must function. He and the next panelist have visited Burma twice in the past year, working on UNDP poverty-oriented projects. After Tommy, David Dapich, is that close enough?
Close enough.
Chief economist of the Indochina program here, will speak about the current economic situation in Burma and its immediate prospects, and how these affect the likelihood of either isolationism or a roadmap, or perhaps the third and fourth way as well might be pursued. And then our final panelist is Mimi Minpu, who's living in New York and has worked to support business students who fled after SLORC assumed control. She's from Burma. She too, in spite of being blacklisted, has recently returned from there, and she'll make general comment on the overall presentations. And then we'll turn finally to the audience, and we are happy, very pleased to have here Ambassador Sybil of India, who's the DCM in Washington, and if he would like to make a question to get us started, he'll be welcome, and if he wouldn't, he can make a comment later if he would like to. So let me start with Tommy.
Graham, thank you very much. Congressman Richardson, thank you very much for coming. You lied about the audience. I got to know Bill Richardson the same way that I got to know Burma, by accident. It's a long story, and we can get into it perhaps at dinner. But let me try a little bit to put the comments that Congressman Richardson spoke about into a little bit of a context regionally in Southeast Asia. Last week, we had a very interesting and lively forum event by having Mr. Robert McNamara come here and give a talk about his book. It was not like tonight is going to be. Tonight, we're going to have a discussion. That was not a discussion. It was Oprah, okay? It was screaming. It was fun. But there was not really a lively debate about what was in his book in retrospect. But part of what's in his book, and I defended his writing of the book. I thought it was an important book. There are many things in it that I would disagree with, but I think the going back and looking at the documents that he used over the years, both from the Pentagon Papers and from the Johnson Library, and his insight into this period of time offered a great deal of insight. And one of the things that he talks a lot about is the domino theory. And he says, you know, the domino theory, we never could prove that the domino theory worked. And he would go through all the memorandum of who was proposing we have to watch out for the domino theory, and made a fairly good argument. I thought Mr. McNamara made a fairly good argument that there was great fear about this. There was enormous tension in the government, an enormous fear among the best and the brightest that they might lose Southeast Asia. And they had to respond to this fear more than they had to respond to any logic. Ultimately, now 30 years later, Mr. McNamara comes here in his writing and says, you know, we feared this thing too much. We worried a little bit too much about this. Now, there's a lot of writing about whether the domino theory was in fact the problem 30 years ago or not. But many of you know that we have been involved, HID has been involved in a number of countries in Southeast Asia, most recently Vietnam. And in my work in Vietnam and in my coming to try to understand Burma, I sense a new domino theory. I don't want to say there is this problem, but I can sense that, you know, the dominoes are back a little bit. You know, it's no longer nation state, but there seems to be a great deal of movement by China to influence its neighbors. And this movement is largely commercial. It's a quasi-relationship in the trading agreements. You know, it's probably like the United States' relationship with Latin America, but it's constant. There's a constant pressure by China using both cultural ways and trade ways and intimidation in many ways to try to get what they want. Now, they no longer have to say to the Khmer Rouge, oh, why don't you take Phnom Penh? They don't have to do that because they have all the factions. There's a sense, and I have this sense in Burma, that China will take great advantage of people leaving it alone. So that the isolation of Burma by the West in response to their actions in 1988 and 1990, which I believe those initial actions by the U.S. and others were justified, the Chinese have taken this and they're using this to their advantage. I met an old man in Burma recently, and I spent the morning with him. We were talking about the economy, and at the end of my few hours with him, I said, sir, I don't want to bother you any further, but what do you think about the relationship with China? I said, in your northern border, you have many people coming across the border living in northern Burma, just as there are many people coming across the Thai border, many people coming across the Lao border, a sort of free emigration into Burma. I said, what do you think about that? He says, well, that's not the big problem. He says, we've always had that sort of thing. I said, well, if that happened in Vietnam, there'd be a war. You know, why aren't you worried about this? Well, he said, it's strictly commercial. He said, what China is doing in Burma is reversing the Burma Road. The Burma Road was built around 1937. It was basically a way for Chiang Kai-shek to have an escape out to Burma, through the Burma Road, down through Lashio, using the railroad to get to Rangoon. This old man was saying to me, well, it's the other way now. When they originally built the Burma Road, they were going to build it not to Lashio to use the railroad, but they were going to build it over to use the Irrawaddy River. And they're now even higher up, using Friendship Bridge and other places coming off the Burma Road, building it over to the Irrawaddy River, and using the Irrawaddy as a commercial route from China through Burma, down the Irrawaddy River, to the Irrawaddy Delta, up the coast to a deep water port that they're building, using this as a way to compete with the commercial aspects of India. And I haven't thought through this thing very well, but I think if you're a U.S. policymaker and you're thinking about the new Domino Theory, and you're thinking about the lack of U.S. response to almost anything in Asia, you need to think about some of these things. I think Congressman Richardson mentioned John McCain recently, who he and some other colleagues did try a fourth way in Vietnam. It was basically a roadmap. And recently, John McCain, a few days ago, gave what I think will be a very, very important speech about Vietnam. They are going to normalize relations with Vietnam shortly. It will be before the fall. Senator McCain and Senator Kerry are largely involved in orchestrating how this will happen. One of their architects is in the front row here, Ms. Frances Winnick. They're going to try to pull this thing off. And Senator McCain the other day gave a speech without saying it, was talking about we should deal with Vietnam much more seriously than we have in the past because someday we're going to need to have a relationship with them, something that we don't know now. I very much think that the situation in Burma, I want to associate myself with the Congressman's fourth way. I don't like people that, I've been to Vietnam probably 75 times, and I consider myself somewhat of a specialist. Since I've only been to Burma 3 times, I know that I don't know very much. But I can sense, my instincts tell me, that the U.S. response there should be much greater and more serious than not having any response at all. And I'm sometimes offended that there is no response, that there is really no thinking about it. And so when you get the opportunity to work with someone like Bill Richardson, Congressman Richardson, I consider it a great national asset that somebody in the United States Congress is interested in this small country, which is not so small. And it's in that spirit that I'd like to welcome you here and say that I'm very grateful for your coming. I'm very grateful for your political insights to this. It is going to be complicated. I remember when, 7 or 8 years ago, John McCain went to a forum in Washington, and he proposed, Congressman, that the United States, 7 years ago, open up an interest section in a foreign embassy in Hanoi. And the foreign policy establishment of the United States thought that this was the most ridiculous proposal that anyone would ever put forward. They said, oh, this senator is just trying to make himself feel good. So if Vietnam is any judge of how these dealing with difficult regimes, how long it takes, it will take a long time for the U.S. to have any relationship with Burma if that's in the cards. I think China would just assume we never have one. And I think that's the problem. Thank you.
What I would like to do very briefly, and probably less colorfully, is talk about Burma, or Myanmar, as it's now called by the current government, in terms of its economic situation and prospects. If we're going to apply economic pressure, it makes sense to understand, I think, how that's likely to impact the country and what the country's like now. Burma is one of the poorest countries in the world. The numbers aren't good, but whether it's $150, $250 per capita, it's right near the bottom. And not only is it near the bottom, but it has had declining income. That is, income from 80 or 85 is higher than it was in 93. Now, it sort of bottomed out about 1990 and has been climbing since, and maybe in a year or two you'll get back to where you were 10 years ago. But, you know, fundamentally, it's not been a great 10 or 15 years for the country. And, you know, population is increasing over 2% a year. It's been a very difficult period. The economy is largely agricultural with associated services. One of the lowest ratios of manufacturing in the world, 7%. I mention that simply because many countries that we try to pressure have large manufacturing exports that they want to send to us. That's not the case. They have virtually no manufacturing exports. Of course, there have been these ethnic wars going on for 40 or 50 years on and off, and of course the democracy movement has had the basic manner law, which was recently overrun by the army. It's possible that those kinds of ethnic military actions will wind down, and as a result, the government may be able to spend less on military spending. This would give them more resources to do other things, obviously. The major exports of Burma are, first of all, opium, which is not in the data. You know, can't look up opium exports in quite the same way you do the others. Actually, the others aren't very accurate either. But anyway, the opium exports are probably, I would say, between $300 and $500 million a year, when all recorded exports are $580 million. So, you know, opium is very important in the economy. I mentioned that. And obviously, you know, embargoes or heroin really won't affect that very much. Gems, teak, rice, increasingly gas as that comes online from the offshore fields, oil seeds, fish, all of these are raw materials which essentially disappear into international trade channels. You can't, I mean, basically most of Asia needs these things. They buy these things. It's not very likely that anything we or even we and the EU, the European Union, would do would have very much of an impact. On a whim, I thought I'd just, you know, sort of look and see how much trade from Burma goes directly to America and to Europe. Now, of course, some goes through Singapore, but, you know, a lot of stuff goes through Singapore. Direct trade is 7% of total Burmese trade with both Europe and North America. So, you know, our ability to pressure them directly is really pretty limited. Now, again, obviously, a little bit more goes through indirectly, but a little bit more might get relabeled as Thai or something, or Indonesian if it goes through Singapore. Who knows where teak comes from? The fact of the matter is that Burma is a country that, you know, has miserable infrastructure, you know, 6% of the Thai level of electricity output. Its macroeconomics is a mess. I mean, inflation is, you know, 2 to 4% a month. Interest rates are lower than inflation. Budget deficits are large. The exchange rate is messed up. Corruption makes a lot of investing uncertain and difficult, especially for European firms, except for the oil sector and gas and so on. There really isn't very much, and some of it has gotten out recently. it's really right now more of a command economy, you know, a military economy, a license economy, than it is a market economy as we understand it. Both credit and capital are real constraints and likely to remain so, I think. I should add that forests are being depleted, a little over 1% a year disappearing. A third of the farm families have 3 acres or less, which is not enough to live on. So, you know, you have a huge fraction of the growing population which can't really make a living from farming. China is, of course, a major trade partner and is a major provider of arms. People are migrating in from China. There are flows of finance from China as well. India has always been a major trading partner. I think in terms of diplomatic contacts, it's perhaps been more active or increasing them, not to indicate approval of the regime, but simply to reduce reliance on any one country, although maybe we can hear more about that from the ambassador. ASEAN is on the record as supporting engagement, or constructive engagement, even though, as one recent ASEAN ambassador, I think it was, said that they were embarrassed by SLORC but felt it was best to have relations with them. Japan certainly seems set to increase aid and is generally supportive of the government. In other words, every neighbor and every significant, you know, economic power in Asia is moving to increase engagement, increase trade, increase aid with this country, and we are not major players. Those are the realities that we have to work with. If I were to make some prognosis for what was going to happen with or without a trade embargo, with or without restrictions on capital movements and so on, beyond those which already exist. The World Bank is not lending. The Asian Development Bank is not now lending. There's very little right now bilateral aid, although Japan will be coming in. The economy, the nation, and the government will certainly survive. There will be uneven growth. It's been 6% recently, at least reported. It probably won't maintain that indefinitely, but could continue for some time. I think that if you look at our interests, besides the obvious interest in encouraging democracy and the geostrategic or political interests that Tom Valley referred to, there is this narcotics interest that we have as a nation. About 3/4 of the heroin in the U.S. comes from Burma. And you know, there is, I think it's fair to say, some tension in our country between those who would like to somehow increase the anti-narcotics aid and those that really want to isolate or punish the country. Either policy can be argued for, but you can't do both. You know, you either sort of engage it, the way you have stopped narcotics in Thailand, not stopped, but slowed it down some, is give peasants, you know, better roads, more economic alternatives, a sort of carrot and stick approach in which you essentially raise the cost of raising heroin and raise the benefit of other things that they can do, higher value crops and so on. Many of the heroin areas are extremely remote and have really nothing else to grow except subsistence crops, which would provide even less than they get, which is not very much. I guess, you know, where I come out is that if U.S. policy is going to take account of reality, it has to realize that I'm sorry?
That's a big if.
Yes, it is. And I often speak in this vein. But, you know, if it's going to take account of reality, it's simply going to have to realize that, you know, if we do something like cut off trade or something, it's going to be largely symbolic. You know, it's going to make us feel good, but it is not going to have a major impact on the short-term economy of Burma or Myanmar. And it's certainly going to act to push the country even closer to its existing allies, such as China, which, of course, are not at all bothered by much of what they're doing. So I guess in conclusion, I'd have to say that my own feelings are that some version of options 2, 3, or 4 are better than option 1, simply because I don't think the rational and factual basis for option 1 applies to the policy, and therefore the policy would be ineffective. Thank you.
Thank you for coming and being interested in Burma. I'm not a politician, I'm not used to public speaking, but I came here because I think it's very important that we take a fresh look at the situation in Burma instead of staying on this fixed image, and also to examine where Burma is today. Some of you may know my background. I've advocated for peace and prosperity in Burma. I've always worked for change in Burma. Worked with student refugees along the border, and also lobbied on the Hill. And I also have been a persona non grata and blacklisted since 1989. But recently I gained permission to visit Burma. And I had a difficult time arriving at that decision. I've always been curious about the changes taking place in Burma and what's really happening. But I couldn't bring myself to apply for a visa. But sometime in the fall of '94, when the authorities decided to meet Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, and also from different expatriates coming back and different tourists coming back and telling me about changes, I thought that I had to go there and take a look for myself instead of just relying on newspaper clippings to make judgments for the country. I will respond to the Congressman's comments later, but I'd like to push forward some very simple ideas for us to think about. And also, these comments are all based on my readings, my experience, and also what I saw there. Before I say anything, let me preface by saying asking you to think of Burma in a new way, and some of my moderate comments I will make. Some of my colleagues here may think that I've crossed the line to the other side. I want to say that that would be a very irresponsible and irrelevant comment, because for me, there is no line to cross. We're all Burmese, and unless we all come together and pool our resources and mobilize everything, Burma cannot come out of this deep, dark hole. It's really in bad shape, as all these distinguished speakers have laid out for you before. I think I got my notes confused. Talking about isolation and trade sanctions, they've said before, it doesn't work. It only works when the whole world gets together. And from what I saw in Burma, there's a lot of activity. There's a lot of Chinese activity, Indian activity, Singaporean activity. It's everywhere. There's a construction boom. Granted, it's only in different pockets. It's not everywhere else. The majority of the country is still very poor, and they're at the subsistence level. But some things are happening. At least some people are getting jobs, and they're able to feed their families. The reality of Burma is the majority of the population is still living in the subsistence economy. They all wanted change. They told the world in 1990 in the election, they voted, they wanted change. But to them, change just means change means freedom from oppression, freedom to pursue their careers, feed their children, have enough food to eat. Because of the dismal economic conditions in the country, my fear as a Burmese, a personal feeling, is Burma could be at the brink of a moral decay. There's corruption everywhere. People are forced to do certain things they normally wouldn't want to do. Government servant makes very little money. They don't make enough money to keep up with the rising inflation costs, so they have to take bribery. Teachers have to sell their grades to survive. You can get anything in Burma for a price. I used to send medicine back home to our relatives, but I mean, everything is there. Consumer goods are there. Even the U.S. Embassy put out the recent business analysis reports. The purchasing power is growing, but of course it's only for a small sector of the population that still needs help. The point I want to make is, I think we need to do a comprehensive some kind of academic social study before we come up with any policy if we really want to benefit the people of Burma. Look at the social situation, the economic situation. And now, well, the gentleman from UNDP has already gone through the human situation and the dismal statistics. Some of the examples are that 2 out of 3 people don't have access to safe drinking water. 85% of the rural population don't have waste disposal means. Some people drink from the same river, bathe in the same river, and do their thing in the same river. 40% of children under 3 suffer from malnutrition. It was very surprising to me to hear these stats because Burma, as you know, was the rice bowl of Asia. It was very rich, has all these massive natural resources, but those are not being used, properly used. I'm not going to go into details, but it's a very emotional issue, and I mean, there are a lot of people exploiting the resource-rich country, a lot of our neighbors. The political reality, this is a sensitive issue. I see 2 things here. One, we had the elections. Even if we don't agree with the aftermath and whatever, we had the election, we had that process. Even countries like China, they may have economic progress, they haven't seen their elections yet. At least we got used to that process, and we have Aung San Suu Kyi as a symbol of hope for the people, symbol of hope, symbol of change, symbol of a new era, untainted by political baggage. As I said before, people want change, which is freedom from oppression. And they kind of use the word democracy interchangeably. And I'd like to say something here. Democracy is a tool to get freedom, and most people, when they think of democracy, they think of structures and processes and institutions. But we have to also think about the essence of democracy, which is understanding that we can differ, we can be different, but we don't have to kill each other because of our different opinions, acknowledging other people's rights, and also the responsibility to settle our differences peacefully. And to be able to do that, I think we need more education, more informed thinking, and the right understanding, and also the mental freedom. Because if you're starving, and if you're hungry, and if your child is sick, you're not going to care which political party you vote for. You're going to take from whoever gives it to you. So I'm here to push for human development, whether it's NGOs or government or bilateral or private or businesses going in, doesn't matter. As long as it benefits the people of Burma, increase their purchasing power, give them the choice to look for jobs, give them the choice to leave the military service and come work in the private sector. I mean, right now, the government is the largest employer. There's not too many jobs going around, but lately, there was construction booms. I mean, direct example is some relatives of mine, they're working in construction. One of my distant female cousins worked for Liz Claiborne as a quality control manager, but she lost her job because Liz Claiborne left. So now she has to rely on her husband's statistician government service salary. I mean, lots of things like that. So I think the most important thing before we talk about democracy, and which of course we all want, and freedom, is human development, and we'll have to help the people of Burma to empower themselves and make them feel that they control their own destiny. I mean, right now, the poor just are at the whim of the rulers. That comes to the next point, comment about the military establishment. Well, I'll tell you about my trip there later. Let me just comment about this. The reality is that the military establishment is an integral part of Burmese society. They will not go away. Even if we want them to go away, nobody likes an oppressive system. It won't go away. It's part of society. And when I say that, I mean it's not just people in guns, but military professionals who are working in the business, professionals who are working in the ration stores, as engineers, technocrats. I mean, they're everywhere. It's not just military per se with guns, but it's certain professional trained people working in different sectors of society, and plus their relatives and their families. So we have to think of all these elements as part of the solution. We are in, as you know, in a nation, again, nation building process. We've been through so many years of civil war. We have to include all these elements. And in general characteristic of a military, I'm sure it's that's about my personal opinion now. I mean, we all want sanctions and we all want them to go away because they have blood on their hands. But look at South Africa. They have blood on their hands too. But if Mandela can work together with de Klerk and if they can start a new era, I don't see why we can't. But I think it will take time. It will take a lot of healing. I mean, it's very hard to forget, your kids and your children being shot down in front of you, but that's just part of history. It's important. It's something we have to remember, but also something we should learn from to prevent in the future. No military or no establishment in power will hand over power without seeking some kind of safeguards for themselves. And what I see now is in Burma, they're trying to do that constitutionally. Yes, they are having this farce, whatever you call it, national convention. They do whatever they're doing, but maybe it may be more productive to think about it in such a way that maybe some group of academics, some group of non-partisan people, if they could participate in this process as advisor, as think tank, perhaps we can somehow affect the outcome and have that balance. We all know the Constitution is a basis for a real democratic society. I mean, I'm not pushing some rhetoric here, but it is true. And I think maybe that's another way, another thing to think about, to really try to publicize and go, well, okay, what's going on in this Constitution? What do you want? What are you looking for? And maybe we should be being watchdogs of this. Maybe get a group of Burmese professionals as well as Harvard think tank people, different groups around the world to comment on this constitutional process, which would not only protect the military from reprisals, but also to safeguard the people's rights and create a proper transition to democratic phase. Yeah, I had mentioned about the fear of this brink of corruption. I mean, Burmese people are very nice people, and they demand very little. I mean, in Burmese, we say if you have rice and oil and salt, you can survive. But really, the situation is going so bad that, I hate to say it as a Burmese, and I'm ashamed. And I hope that we all do something to elevate the standard of living of the people first, so we don't see Burma fall into this abyss of moral decay and this deep dark hole. Some comments on the Congressman's remarks. We talked about the fourth way. I think that when you want to approach the Burmese, you have to think like a Burmese, and maybe more like a Buddhist and the Burmese way. Putting someone against a wall and setting deadlines, I don't think it will work, especially with people who are feeling a little guilty, maybe, and people who sometimes genuinely do believe they're doing something good for the country. Anyway, to say it's a sham democratic process, like I said, maybe we should think about getting involved in the constitutional process and try to publicize it. Deadlines against the wall, I don't think it'll work. Maybe there's a fifth way where we can encourage the Aung San Suu Kyi and the full elected members, as well as some of the military establishment to come together, which I think is probably the only way. And some of of course, the ethnic representation. And everybody has to have goodwill and faith, because without that, we have nothing. And Burma will probably disappear from the map of the earth if the domino falls. Thank you very much.
So I think we have enough to get us started. We're open for general discussion. Let me see if the ambassador would like to make a comment or a question, if you would. And I also notice in the audience there are many people here who know a lot about Burma. Lucian Pai has been interested in this subject for a long time. So Lucian, if you would like to say something, you'd be welcome, but Let's start with
I
the
thought I'll
ambassador.
just make a few comments since India was mentioned by one or two speakers. You know, after the problem began in Burma some years ago, we were confronted with a very difficult dilemma, because Burma is our neighbor. And it's not only our neighbor, it is situated on the eastern part of our country, and in that part of India, we've had very difficult political problems ever since our independence. There have been several insurgencies in that part of India, and some are continuing even now. Many of these insurgents take refuge across the border in Burma. In order to control these insurgencies, it is imperative that we have a working relationship with any government in Burma. There is also the problem of drugs, because a lot of drugs from Burma are going to Nepal, to Bangladesh. There is Indian territory that is used. Fortunately, in the eastern part of our country, we don't have a serious drug problem. But if these reservoirs were to develop more, we could land up with a serious drug problem in the eastern part of our country. Now, we tried to distance ourselves from the SLORC for some years. In fact, the SLORC was rather unhappy with India because they felt that India was interfering in the internal affairs of Burma. They were objecting to radio broadcasts from India in support of Suu Kyi. And then we found that this policy of distancing ourselves from the Burmese regime was not yielding us any good results. On the contrary, it was creating more problems for us, because the Chinese were very active, became very active in Burma. They are very active in Burma. They are given very large-scale military aid to the Burmese regime. They are also engaged in developing a deep water port in Burma, which of course raises certain questions in our minds about the strategic implications of this for us, because we have to be careful that we are not outflanked on our eastern border in this way. There are of course reports to which the speaker had alluded about large-scale infiltration of Chinese into Burma, whether for commercial or other reasons. There is also the fact that the Chinese have established a listening post on the Cocos Islands, which are a few miles away from the Andaman Islands. We also found that the ASEAN countries, as again the speakers referred to, have been trying to pursue a policy of constructive engagement with Burma. These are countries which could, especially Thailand, play a very important role in Burma, but they have chosen to follow a policy not of sanctions, not of isolation, not of distancing themselves, but rather of incorporating Burma increasingly into ASEAN structures. And I think at the last ASEAN meeting, the Burmese were invited as observers, and it may not be very long before they are participants in the ARF or some other ASEAN institutions. It is for these reasons that in recent years we have had a change in policy, and Mr. Dapiche said very correctly that our increased interaction with Burma has nothing to do with the approval of the regime, but it is a pragmatic decision we have taken, because we must ultimately protect our own interests, and for the reasons that I have mentioned, it's imperative that we have a working relationship with the Burmese government. With regard to Congressman Bill Richardson's proposal about having some kind of a contact group under UN auspices or otherwise, seeking to put pressure on the Burmese government, I personally feel that this is not an approach that is likely to yield results. For two reasons. One, of course, that you must have full Chinese participation, which it's unlikely that you will get. And on the other hand, you are also unlikely to get the cooperation of the ASEAN countries. And then again, for any policy of establishing a contact group with a view to putting pressure on Burma, for any such policy to succeed, it is imperative that your own partners in the ASEAN cooperate with you, and it seems rather, I'm rather skeptical that this will happen. Thank you.
You see, if I could, see, Ambassador, I think that's the problem. See, when we talk about constructive engagement, what I worry about, what ASEAN countries are doing, what you've done, I say this with all due respect, is you've done nothing. I mean, you've engaged the Burmese, you deal with them, you trade with them, but you don't put any pressure on them. And what I don't want to see out of this exercise is for us, the international community, the United States, ASEAN, to reward Burma for getting worse, for violating human rights, for, you know, there are reports that they've left 8,000 people on the Thai-Burmese border homeless, Karen refugees, they've been kidnapped, forced to return to Burma. I mean, see, so what I would like to see is, I'm very close to, I almost, before Valerie talked to me, I almost myself
Don't tell all the secrets.
introduced the, well, all right, I won't. The sanctions initiative, I almost had it drafted myself. Now, I'm talking just about the United States, and I admit that it may not totally work. But what I am talking about is, I think Australia has shown leadership in putting some heat on Burma. And the objective here would be countries like India that have strong human rights traditions, and the United States, and I think the Thais are basically hopeless. I don't think they'll do anything. Perhaps we can persuade some others. Japan has occasional bursts of conscience. We do too. We're not perfect. That we multilateralize the pressure, and that we say, look, July 11th, you don't let this woman out. You announce that you're going to move ahead with putting sanctions and keeping her in prison. Yeah, I'm ready to write this resolution of cut off myself. Now, there are those right now that want to cut it off, even, and it would have some effect. I mean, there's a substantial Unocal oil investment there. There's some American blue jeans operations there. Many have been pulling out, American companies. I've tried to get the American business community to go to the SLORC and say, hey, look, you've got to democratize. We're not threatening you, but we're a source of constructive pressure. The U.S. business communities refuse to do anything, typically. You know, they want to make some bucks. So who is left to stand up for human rights? Maybe it makes us feel good eventually. But I guess I'm reaching a point where at not having some kind of progress, I'm ready to throw my hands in the air and join the option ones. But I think if we are going to look at a new way, it has to involve you. It has to involve Australia. It doesn't have to be led by us, but we've got to, I think, multilateralize the pressure. Otherwise, what is constructive? They're going to continue going into refugee camps. They're going to keep this woman. I mean, this is a woman that deserves international support. They're going to. You ought to see this prison. I mean, I went to this prison. We should once in a while stand for something, and here's where I think we should together.
Would you like to make a short
Yes.
reply?
So far as Suu Kyi is concerned, as perhaps you know, that we have a historical relationship with her family, and she's held in great esteem in India. But the question I have in mind is that for reasons of restoring democracy or for protecting human rights, you would suggest that the Burmese government, the SLOC, be made an example of. But the question I have in mind is which countries which are neighboring to Burma, would like that kind of an example to be made out of Burma. Because I do not wish to pass value judgments on any country because they are entitled to whatever government they want to have. But how many countries around are democracies really? And on the issue of human rights, you have serious problems with the ASEAN countries. So, you know, that's the practical difficulty.
But Ambassador, the SLORC stole the election. Aung San Suu Kyi won fair and square. She got 90% of the vote. That's why we're in this mess. They put her in jail. They put all her supporters in jail. They abolished the democracy. I mean, how could we got to stand for something, don't you think?
Then I have absolutely no quarrel with the fact that it is an unacceptable situation in political terms. But I think in the larger perspective, it's very difficult to try and shape the world entirely in accordance with one's sense of what is appropriate. And in practical terms, when you start dealing with these things in the field, unless, of course, there's a radical change in how nations relate to each other, and what is the extent of interference, if you like, that outside countries can have in the internal affairs of another country. This issue is becoming very topical and relevant. And while it is a fact that in recent years, especially after the end of the Cold War, increasingly there is acceptance that there are certain developments, there are certain situations in which issues do not remain any longer the internal affairs of countries. Yet I don't think that international practice has evolved to that extent, that there is now a solid international consensus behind these things. And therefore, much as India would very much like to be part of an effort in which democracy is restored, and for a few years we tried at great cost to our interests, we found that in practical terms, well, other countries which were even more closely involved in Burma were paying scant regard to this, and in fact we were seeing that our vital interests were suffering. We had to change course. So I'm merely speaking in terms of the practical dimensions, not the moral dimension. Thank you.
I'm tempted to abuse the chair and make just a comment in passing, and then let me suggest that you stand up at the microphones if you would. And this gentleman was up first, yes, if you would, too. Please, yes, okay.
Congressman Richard.
Excuse just 1 second. This gentleman was next, and I'm going to make a comment as I go to him. Then we're coming to you. I apologize. You'll then understand the ground rules. I think that if this exchange between the ambassador and the congressman reminds me that there is a substantial chance that the Clinton administration, having taken the lead in unilateral embargoes against Iran, as was announced today, Congress may encourage an equivalent lead in a unilateral economic embargo against Burma, and I think these will, in both instances, be equally effective, namely not at all. So, please.
Thank you. My name is Simon Billiness, and I'm not exactly a disinterested party in this debate.
Yes, please identify yourself
Sure.
as you do.
Yeah, Simon Billiness, and I'm an investment banker at Franklin Research here in Boston, and also one of the people who helped found the Coalition for Corporate Withdrawal from Burma, which is fairly self-explanatory. And one thing I wanted to sort of ask and raise is there's a lot of talk about, Mr. DePace talked about trade, but didn't focus at all on investment. And as you probably know, US oil companies, Unocal and also Texaco, are amongst the largest foreign investors in Burma. In fact, it's kind of ironic that as we speak, there's actually a demonstration going on outside ARCO's headquarters.
Why are you here?
Outside their annual meeting in Los Angeles, asking them not to sign a contract, exploration contract with the SLORC. And I'd like to touch on one of Mimi's comments about focusing on benefiting the people of Burma. When you look very closely at US oil investment in Burma, you can see that it disproportionately benefits the SLORC, whilst
Oil
providing...
investment, I'm talking about smaller cottage
Yeah.
industry development,
Yeah,
clothing, non-infrastructure.
I'm building on your comment about focusing on the people, which I think is a good comment. But when you look at oil investment specifically, you can see that it's disproportionately benefiting the regime. They pay usually around $6 million up front in hard currency as a signing bonus. And when you look at Unocal's deal, it's simply taking gas to Thailand where it's being sold to cash. It's not building up any kind of infrastructure, economic infrastructure within Burma. The SLORC is going to take a huge cut off the top of that.
So let me get you to put your question, please.
Yeah. My question is, faced with this kind of investment, particularly Unocal's, which is not helping the people but harming the people and bolstering the SLORC, how does the various approaches that people have brought up, the fourth way, constructive engagement, sanctions, how will that be able to target investments like this, which are just benefiting the SLORC?
I think you'll have to set up guidelines for people who are thinking about investment in Burma. I don't think you should stop them from going in if they're going to create more jobs and teach people how to have a responsible job, how to have the responsibility to keep their jobs, some technical training, provide some discipline, because a lot of people in Burma don't have work to do.
So would you say when you hear reports from Amnesty and Human Rights Watch that
No, the
villages are being-
corporation should have its own corporate policy.
Sure, sure. I mean, with those kinds of guidelines that you mentioned, would that include a guideline saying that companies shouldn't get involved in projects when, for instance, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are saying that villages are being forcibly relocated to make way for this gas
Yeah,
pipeline?
but I'm trying to talk about the 45 million people of Burma. Yes, it's unfortunate things are happening. I can't comment on that. I don't know why it happens. But, I mean, there are certain conditions in society that are conducive to brutal force and military intervention, and I think the first thing we have to do is raise the level of that society. I mean, an example comes to mind about Thailand. In the 70s, there was a coup every year, twice a year. But the recent one by Suchinda failed because the very nature of Thai society had changed. There was more educated people, larger middle class, more communication. I mean, perhaps if we can bring Burmese, I mean, poverty itself is an oppression. If we can bring those people out of the poverty mode, maybe they'll start thinking more about demanding their rights and having more choices. Maybe they can have their own cottage industries and businesses, and then they'll make their own choices.
How would Congressman Richardson
Let me,
see
let
where
me, let me
fit into
ask
this?
David to comment, and then we'll ask Congressman.
Sure.
My measure for whether or not to do something is if it works. Okay, you had an identical case in Iran. We threw out an American oil company, 2 or 3 European oil companies within the next day. Okay, I've talked to the guy in Total. They'd be happy to take the whole project. You've got the Japanese, the Taiwanese oil companies. These are jack-up rigs. It's shallow water. They know where the gas is. This gas is going to be flowing to Thailand no matter what. And, you know, you may feel good. It might even be a good idea in a moral statement terms to keep out an American oil company, but it's not going to make a damn bit of difference about when the gas flows.
Okay, Congressman Richardson, please.
Real brief. Under the sanctions provision that would be drafted by the U.S. Congress that is probably going to emerge very soon, investment would be affected. You can't cut it off. Trade, and you can, yes. Similar to the Cuban trade embargo, and my understanding is that's what's being drafted. On the constructive engagement, it's not affected at all. Those that advocate constructive engagement. Those under the Clinton policy, it's not affected because the Clinton position is basically, unless you make it multilateral, an embargo or investment, it's not going to work. Under my fourth way, which I haven't, as I said, thought totally through, you would set deadlines where that type of sanction would be an instrument of policy.
Like the Australian benchmarks.
Yeah, but I haven't figured out how many days or in exchange for what. But this is what I think the contact group, multilaterally, Asian countries can do, should do. But I commend you for your effort.
Okay, the gentleman here, please.
Hi, I'm John Barrett. I'm a school teacher, and I'm a retired lawyer interested in human rights issues. Congressman Richardson, I commend you and Professor Allison and the panel for focusing on this important issue. Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." I'm wondering to what extent we need to work out a fairly uniform policy on human rights for different countries. If we're talking about Tibet or China or Timor, will our policy be more effective if we have some broad principles rather than working a deal with individual governments? And then when you come to the Burma situation, a few of the problems we have to deal with, there's a terrific AIDS problem all over South Asia. It's very bad in Thailand. It hasn't really surfaced yet in India, but they say there's 1 million people HIV positive. You have large rebel forces in parts of Burma, including the areas where the heroin comes from. People question whether the government could control the heroin traffic even if it wanted to. Is there some case for self-determination for some of these peoples that are rebelling? And what about the refugees in Bangladesh? And I'm very glad you're working on this issue.
Okay. Would you like to make a comment?
Let Sid answer the question. She's right behind. I'll respond to it.
Okay, just a quick response because we've run over time, but I think since this is a topic of considerable interest to the folks who are gathered, we're going to take another about 8 minutes. And if anybody is obliged to leave, they might do so. But short questions and short answers. starting with this one.
I think it's very, very difficult to have a uniform approach to human rights and I think it's very difficult, John, to come up with a consistent way. I think one of the things that we might talk a little bit about the contact group, and I think it's representative in the ambassador's comments here, and I agree with both the ambassador and Mimi, that too much of the U.S. agenda in the contact group won't work. I think the genius of the contact group, if there can be one, is that the agenda of what you're looking for on the human rights front and on other fronts cannot be the U.S. agenda. It has to be something that the neighboring countries also would like to accomplish. It's not going to please everybody. It would have to be, I think, at a lower level of accomplishment than might make everybody happy.
Okay,
I just would like to add something. You're talking about what the neighboring people want, but we should also take into account what the Burmese people want. And perhaps you should pioneer some academic study project from Harvard and go in there and do something.
We can't get permission to do that.
Okay, but a good thought. Now, somebody's here from Asia Watch, is this correct?
Sydney.
Sydney, if you're following up on the same point, and then we come here, please.
Okay, I'm Sydney.
Introduce yourself too,
Yeah,
please.
I'm Sydney Jones. I'm the executive director of what used to be Asia Watch and is now called Human Rights Watch Asia. But I wanted to comment on some of the issues that Congressman Richardson raised, because I also admire what Congressman Richardson has done in terms of opening a dialogue with Aung San Suu Kyi and with the SLORC. But I don't agree with his division into four ways or four different options, because I think there's a vast amount of overlap between them. For example, our organization has favored a corporate withdrawal and an end to new investment in Burma. At the same time, we're very much in favor of a contact group, and I think the question is a contact group toward what end? You have the roadmap, as it were, laid out in General Assembly resolutions that were passed unanimously or adopted unanimously by the General Assembly in 1993 and 1994 that spell out very specifically what needs to be achieved. There's your multilateral base for getting a group together. I think even now, while I don't think China would ever be a member of the contact group, it's not wholly inconceivable that you could get a member of an ASEAN country to take part in that. Certainly the Philippines might be a possibility, but even Thailand, given the events of the weekend where you've had incursions into Thai territory, and the Thai government is actually extremely upset now, you might be able to get them on board in some ways. And I think that's where U.S. policy should be headed, using the UN resolutions as a base and talking up a roadmap in terms of what you need to do in order to get specific elements of that resolution accomplished. Thanks.
Okay. Let me, rather than do answers to each of the points, let me ask you each to put your point as briefly as possible, and we'll take a couple of points and then we'll take it to the panel, please.
I'm glad that the subject of the embargo against Iran was brought up, and also Cuba. And the first part of my question was going to be, how is Burma so different from, I mean, if the United States government can move the way it has against Cuba, intensified the embargo against Cuba, now there's talk of intensifying it even more. Today's news about Iran, go through the history of where the United States has been quite ready to impose various forms of sanctions. So what's the problem in Burma? And the second question is, I think, although it resurfaces through the discussion, efficacy is obviously important. I second the comments just made in terms of multilateral efforts. But I think it's a mistake to, Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison turning down deals. I think it's important to get back to the moral dimension, not just to talk about efficacy. I mean, frankly, I'm not sure I care whether if somebody else is going to go make a buck in a corrupt, murderous, dictatorial country where a Nobel Peace Prize winner is in prison. I'm not sure I care whether somebody else is going to make that buck. If that means that 7% of the trade from the United States is going to be foregone. Although, again, there are questions of who's going to benefit, but I think I want to reiterate and re-ask the moral aspect of this.
Good question. Here, please.
My name is Helga Bowes. I'm a student at this place. Congressman Richardson, perhaps as an addendum to your fourth option, as much as we all admire Aung San Suu Kyi and her strength and her commitment, she is more of a symbol than anything more than that. There are groups on the border who were on the border before the huts were burned down who were actual elected representatives of the government in 1990. There are groups on the border that bring together all ethnic groups and Burmese democratic forces, and every time I hear a panel like this, they get routinely ignored. The National Coalition Government of Union of Burma, Democratic Alliance of Burma. Perhaps you would think about, as part of your fourth option, to look at these groups as someone to work with for democratization, not to ignore. They are amateur politicians, and sometimes you wonder about the qualifications, but that's because they've had very little attention, and somebody of your stature might want to give them some.
Excellent, excellent suggestion. We're going to take, sorry, just the last two up, this one, and I apologize to the others, please. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Joseph Harrington, and 50 years ago I was stationed in Missionar in Burma, in North Burma. We were flying supplies. That was the only way China got things. They finally had the Burma Road built. Incidentally, they also built a pipeline, which not many people know about, to get the gasoline over there. My question is, would you expand a little bit more on the Chinese moving in? Is that the official Chinese or refugees coming into North Burma? I've read little about it. Thank you.
Good. Please.
I'm Frances Swinning with the U.S.-Vietnam Trade Council. Prior to this, I was working at the U.S. Mission in Burma, was part of my portfolio.
She went to the Fletcher School with the Congressman.
My question is, Congressman, how can we set up a dynamic similar to the one that was in place last year, where we did have a contact group? It was the ASEAN nations. I think that is the route to go. They are embarrassed by what's happening in Burma, and they did put pressure. Your trip there helped set up that dynamic, and we saw results with the July ASEAN meeting. A second question is, isn't the problem really that there's not continuity in American foreign policy, and we're not paying enough attention to this issue?
Okay, thank you. I apologize to the other folks who had questions, because we could obviously go on with this topic for quite a long time. Let me ask if we have any very short comments from the
I'll talk to the gentleman right after.
Okay,
about
you'll
the
tell
Burma
him the answer on the Burma Road. Mimi, would you like to make a short comments, and we'll let Bill Richardson make the final comment? Yeah.
Well, I think that setting American standards for a part of the world where the most pressing need is basic primary needs of the people could sound ethnocentric. I know human rights is really important, but we can't really, set such high standards. We'll have to be a little bit more patient and yet firm. We're a Buddhist saying where you stand as a strong oak tree. You can bend, you can break after a storm, but a bamboo that sways with the wind still stands tall after the storm is over. Thank you.
Okay. Apologies. Next, David.
I would like to talk about the moral aspect, and I just seconding what you said. It seems to me that this is fundamentally a situation in which the poverty of the people at least has to be balanced. When you're thinking about democracy, we have to think also about any geostrategic interests that we might have. I'm not sure what the best way is to encourage Burma as a nation to move towards democracy. I would like to do that. I don't think it makes sense to stand largely alone when all of the major neighbors around are of another mind and going in an opposite direction. I mean, that's dumb. Okay. I mean, it's one thing with South Africa, but it's quite another thing if, we're 12,000 miles away and of no particular importance and doing something that doesn't matter very much. I mean, it might make us feel good. The only other thing I have to say is that for consistency, of course, Algeria overthrew the elections. Nigeria overthrew the elections. Election before last, Mexico arguably stole the election. I mean, if we're going to start getting, really focusing on elections that have been overthrown, it seems to me we basically have to take on a good deal more of the world than we have thus far, not to mention Timor or China.
Okay. Comment for...
I'll wait.
You go.
I'd like...
Burma you'll tell after, but...
I'd like to comment a little bit on the statement about why should we make a deal. Well, I think basically Aung San Suu Kyi is a very, very skillful and very, very brilliant politician. And I don't know much about her. I've read what she's written. I've read the interview she had with Congressman Richardson. I've watched her operate, and she's really, really skillful. And Slork inadvertently made her stronger than she was. They made her a political figure. They made her a hero. And frankly, whatever we do here, we're going to set the stage for her to make a deal. And we can either help her make a deal, or we can be on the sidelines. I think India is closer to helping her make a deal. I think Japan is closer to helping her make a deal. When Japan talks to Slork, it gives them something. And these pieces aren't well orchestrated, but she's waiting for the proper time, which is not now. I think I agree with Bill Richardson's assessment that there's a lack of ability inside Slork to operate right now. And that makes all this discussion very, very difficult. I think the tragedy would be if the U.S. went down the road of distancing themselves further from this situation. I think you need to get her into a situation where she can use her political skill to make a deal that benefits the future of the country.
Excellent. Final comment by Congressman Richardson.
I would close by saying, look, who knows, right? None of us have the answer. I thought this through the last 45 minutes, thinking that what is not acceptable now is current policy, whatever it is, by anybody, because things are getting worse in Burma. Aung San Suu Kyi is still in prison. I think what Mimi mentioned, there's misery there. The world's taking a back seat on Burma because it's a small country and it's not strategically important. I mean, we beat our chests on China, on Tibet, and many of the others, and there's a tension. But Burma, and sometimes you wonder, well, we'll be tough on Burma because we can't be tough on China because they got those strategic interests and all those bucks. So what I am offering is this. What I think we should do is, does it amount to the United States? Again, yes. It always does. We can talk about let somebody else take the lead. No one else is going to take the lead, unfortunately. So what I would do is I would urge the administration to organize a contact group. Membership, I don't know, I haven't thought it through. Vallely probably has more. I'd like to see India, but I'd want the ambassador to be a little bit tougher. I'd like to see Japan. I'd like to see maybe the Thais, Sydney. Maybe you're right. They're sufficiently mad that they can participate. I have my doubts, though. Australia, beautiful, good, consistent policy. Maybe it can't be the neighbors. Let's try to get China involved, although, who knows? But let's try something. And use the multilateral pressure to set deadlines. All right, July 11th, for me, is going to be a very strong personal deadline. If they say they're going to keep this woman in jail, and they're not going to, because letting her out of jail triggers other democratic movements within Burma. I'm not just trying to say to her, and I recognize what this young man said. There are a lot of other players that deserve attention and support, but she got 89% of the vote. So she's not just some, femme fatale. She got votes, and she is, by a lot of people, acknowledged to be their leader. So I haven't thought about the staging of this pressure. But deadlines, yeah, I do, and Mimi may be right. It may not work. And then eventually maybe we'll cut off trade and investment. It may happen anyway. It may happen next month by a Republican, by the way, in the Senate. And I may do it in the House. Who knows? But at least we've stood for something. And while it's not going to improve the situation, maybe the SLORC will think that UNOCAL investment makes a difference, and they want to preserve it. So I measured, so they may change. They may do something that's positive. I measured mildly the success of my first trip. I know that I got 3 political prisoners out of jail. And I thought that, well, was it worth it? Yeah, it was, just to get those. And I know that right before I went the second time to Burma, the prisons were improved. One of the prisoners joked, a young man, Min Kon Yang, I have a terrible time. He said, you know why I knew you were coming? The last 30 days I've been fed very well. And is that progress? Yeah. Maybe if we go inch by inch. And I think, Sidney, you just endorsed my fourth option. I don't know if you realize that, but
You haven't read what the UN report she's talking about.
no, I think the UN General Assembly, I think that's baloney. That's not serious. I mean, let's talk about a contact group that spends its time on Burma. Let's talk about the UN Secretary General really focusing on Burma, not, you know, he sent a couple of missionary envoys there that didn't do anything. You know that. They haven't reported on anything that's substantial. And I think you multilateralize, we may be better off. We may not be. But what I don't want is for us to be back here in a year where things are worse and we haven't done anything. So I offered that small change, and I'm sure it can be refined by many years.
Let me, on behalf of the audience and the school, thank the members of our panel for an excellent educational evening.
Good. Good. A lot of these people come for dinner.
Okay. Can I smoke my cigar?
We're trying to get
I'll give you this. Thank you much.
Hey, thanks, Graham. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Good for you. Oh, yeah.
You do,
Yeah, I talk every day.
Do you? I just think we gotta do, I don't know. You did the right thing. I think there are some economic levers, but, you know, our business community, they're such mercenaries.
I've talked with Unicom for 2 years. I've given up.
You know, there's
The guys are pigs.
Hey, you're right about that. And, you know, some of those groups resent that she gets all that attention.